A dark plant-type archetype run by a sociopath duelist hell-bent on making every duelist's life he sees a living hell is all the proof we need to prove that vegans are evil. One thing for sure is that Predaplants did way better in the anime than in the actual TCG, which is heartbreaking to hear, seeing that they've had a unique impact on the game. While the deck just couldn't find a way to break through, parts of the archetypes became engines in the game that helped shape formats and deck builds, be it in the main or extra deck. So how does a deck with a solid type and one of the strongest attributes in the game fail? Predaplants focus on two main things: fusion summoning and spreading Predaplant counters. Most of the time, if a Predaplant counter was on a monster, its level would become 1 if it was 2 or higher. However, that's only if there's a Predaplant monster with that set effect on it. In all other cases, they'd sit there useless on the monster. So you can probably guess this was already a negative on this archetype. They did find a way not to make the counter utterly irrelevant, as you'll see later on in the video. These carnivorous flowers debuted in Invasion Vengeance in 2016 with 6 cards at their disposal. We'll start with Predaplant Flytrap, a level 2 dark plant monster with 400 attack and 800 defense. Once per turn, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls. Place a predator counter on it, and if it's level 2 or higher, it becomes level 1 as long as it has a predator counter. At the start of the damage step, when this card battles a monster with an equal or lower level, you can destroy that monster, then increase this card's level by the original level of the destroyed monster. Predaplant Moray Nepenthes had 1600 attack and 1000 defense. This card gains 200 attack for each predator counter on the field. When this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can equip that monster to this card. Once per turn, you can target one monster card equipped to this card by its effect, destroy it, and gain life points equal to its original attack. Predaplant Squid Drosera lets you send this card from your hand to the graveyard, then target one face-up monster you control. That turn, it can attack all monsters your opponent controls with a predator counter once each. If this face-up card leaves the field, place a predator counter on each special summon monster your opponent controls. And if you do, any of those that are level 2 or higher become level 1 as long as they have that counter. Finally, you can't mention Predaplants without their ace, Yuri's partner in Heinous Axe, Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. This monster was a level 8 Dark Fusion that required 2 non-token dark monsters on the field to fuse. And if this card is fusion summoned, you can make this card gain attack equal to the attack of one special summon monster your opponent controls. And once per turn, you can target a level 5 or higher monster your opponent controls. Until the end phase, its name becomes that monster's original name, and replaces its effect with that monster's original effects. If this fusion summon card is destroyed, you can destroy all of your opponent's special summon monsters. The first wave of monster support left a lot to be desired, as the archetype started with no searchers to dig for Predaplants and no extenders to place monsters on the field. However, they had access to Lone Fire Blossom if they needed, and Allure for their draw power. However, they didn't do much by themselves. Predaplant counters didn't hinder your opponent unless they were synchro summoning or required anything concerning levels. Also, counters couldn't affect any face-down monsters or monsters that didn't have levels like Xyz and later on Lynx. Also, the deck didn't give any pluses off your fusion summoning, a significant problem that hinders the fusion mechanic. Using almost 2 to 3 sources to fusion summon left you with little to work with if something goes awry. It wasn't all bad news, however. Starving Venom was the real star and saw play. It wasn't for its effects, but rather its materials, because the fusion required just 2 generic dark monsters, making this card a great option to use with Super Poly. You could change the game in your favor by fusing into this card with Super Poly and eliminating any pesky monsters your opponent controls. The Dark attribute is the most common in all game levels, from main deck to extra. It was always a solid idea to tech Venom Dragon your extra deck and either main or side Super Poly depending on your matchup. The final card that Predaplants received for this set was Predaplanet, a continuous trap card. If a monster with a predator counter leaves the field while this card is face up on the field, add a Predap card from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect to Predaplanet once per turn. You can banish this card from your graveyard to fusion summon a fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from your hand or field as materials. As good as its main effect is, its downfall was it being a continuous trap, and needing a condition to activate its effect. Not to mention that its graveyard effect was the actual effect the Predaplants needed, a card to help them fusion summon. The lack of ways to get to polymerization or any cards that search fusion spells didn't help the deck either. Fusion Enforcers did help them with more support. And though there weren't any fusion support spells meant for Predaplants in a heavily fusion-based pack for some reason, they did get a core staple monster that lessened the pain of playing Predaplants. Predaplant Chlamydisundu was a level 2 monster. Monsters with predator counters that you use as fusion materials are treated as dark. During your main phase, you can fusion summon one dark fusion monster from your extra deck using this card in the field, and a monster from your hand, field, and or monsters with predator counters your opponent controls as fusion materials. With this card in their arsenal, it relieved a bit of pressure getting to a fusion spell or polymerization. It also used your opponent's monsters that you can stick with a counter, giving you a removal option if you went second. That wasn't the only cool thing this salad of an archetype got. Predaplant Saracenian lets you special summon this card whenever your opponent tries to hit you with a direct attack. After damage calculation, if this card battled an opponent's monster, you can destroy your opponent's monster. If this card was destroyed by battle or sent to the grave by a card effect, you could add a Predap card from your deck to your hand, except this card. Predaplant Drosophilum Hydra could be special summoned from your hand or graveyard by attributing one monster on either player's field with a Predator counter. If this card's on the field or in your graveyard, you can banish another Predaplant monster from your graveyard, then target a face-up monster on the field and it loses 500 attack. Predaplant Terrapenthus allowed you to place a Predator counter on a monster and change it to level 1 when it inflicts battle damage. Once per turn, you can target one monster opponent controls to the level less than or equal to this card's and take control of it until the end phase. Predaplant's Benodianaya places a Predator counter on a monster when you normal or special summon it, and after damage calculation, if this card battled a monster with an equal or lower level, you can special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck, except this card. They also received 2 more fusions to further support Predaplants in Predaplant Chimerophagia, and even more Starving Dragon, Greedy Venom Fusion Dragon. Predaplant Chimerophagia was a level 6 fusion monster. It required a Predaplant plus a Dark-type monster as its materials. And once per turn, you could target a monster in the field with a level less than or equal to this card's and banish it. When this card battles an opponent, you can have it gain 1000 attack and make your opponent lose 1000 attack. And during the standby phase after it was sent to the graveyard, you can add a Poly or Fusion spell card from your deck to your hand. Greedy Venom Fusion Dragon required a Predaplant monster plus a Dark monster with an original level of 8 or higher. Once per turn, you could target a face-up monster in the field, and until the end of the turn, you would change its attack to 0 and its effects were negated. If it was destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you could destroy as many monsters in the field as possible. Then banish a level 8 or higher Dark monster from your graveyard to special summon this card back from the grave. Now, outside of Calamitous Sundew, the monster's support was decent. Saraceniant was a great searcher that could prevent you from losing the game with his Gorz-like ability. Drosophilum Hydra could double as both an extra body and more monster removal if your opponent's monsters had counters. Spidonianaya could be a search power if you swing over a monster with counters on it. And Terrapenthus was there for moral support. However, the deck still lacked the ability to get to fusion spells fast enough, even with Chimerophagia, whose effective fetching fusions or polymerization spell was slow and required it to be in the graveyard. You'd have to wait until your next standby phase to get your spell anyway, so you don't even get to use it until the next turn. For the new spells, we received Predapruning and Predaponics. Predapruning would bring back a Predaplant monster from the graveyard. Predaponics was a continuous spell that once per turn allowed you to special summon a level 4 or lower Predaplant monster from your hand or graveyard, but its effects were negated. Both were good options, but Predapruning became more of the solid option over time, with it being a soft once per turn and not being limited to level 4 or lower Predaplant monsters. Even with this support, the deck still needed help consistently with fusion summoning. It was being outperformed by other fusion decks that were in Fusion Enforcers like Invoked and even Fluffle, as both had more consistent engines to get to their pieces and even in archetype fusion spells, like Fight for Fusion and Invocation. So to fix this, Konami decided they would make an excellent, simple monster engine for Predaplants. What ended up happening was they made one of the most abused engines in the game. Introduced in Maximum Crisis, Konami gave one of the best duos in human history since Peanut Butter and Jelly. Predaplant Orphis Scorpio was a level 3 plant monster that on normal or special allowed you to send one monster from your hand to the graveyard to special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck. The main target would be Darlingtonia Cobra. As once per duel, when Darlingtonia Cobra is special summoned by a Predaplant monster effect, you can add one Polymerization spell card or Fusion spell card from your deck to your hand. What was supposed to be a simple engine for Predaplant decks became a TCG game changer for every deck, be it Fusion or non-Fusion decks. At first glance, grabbing a Polymerization or Fusion spell card doesn't seem like much. It's not until you realize how vast the pool of Polymerization/Fusion spell cards is. Enter Brilliant Fusion, a continuous spell card that sends fusion materials from your deck to the graveyard to special summon a Gem Knight fusion monster from your extra deck. Using Brilliant Fusion allows you to play Gem Knight Seraphonite, whose effect gives you an extra normal summon in addition to your normal summoner set for that turn. This helped in various decks ranging from Gem Knight FTK to any 60 card pile. What made the Predaplant pack even better was that Scorpio and Darlingtonia Cobra were level 3s, making them great fodder for rank 3s and link 2s. This meant a free MX Saber Invoker almost every time, giving access to a free extension of Invoker's effect. Add the fact the engine was searchable thanks to a certain fire plant, and you have a guaranteed engine you can get going first or second every time. Though Brilliant Fusion has been chucked in the Forbidden List since 2020, the Predaplant duo still sees play in decks like Branded Predaplants and various rogue fusion decks needing search power for their fusion spells. Predaplants got great support to work with. Oh, and Predaplant Cordyceps was also printed, which added nothing to Predaplant's gameplay. This leads to the question, why didn't it impact Predaplants as much as other decks that used it? Well, we can start with the fact that those decks were more versatile and had a variety of starters that Predaplants didn't have. Most 60 card piles had multiple ways to create their plays, while Predaplants were linear in what they could start with and how strong of a board they could make, which wasn't a lot due to them not having great first turn options outside of Chimera Flesia. It also didn't help that during this time, Master Rule 4 was in effect, meaning you'd effectively only have one extra deck zone to use unless a link marker was pointing towards that zone. This doomed decks that didn't utilize link monsters, and Predaplants was one of the many victims of this rule due to the archetype being solely focused on fusions. Also, the final nail in the coffin was this deck couldn't play through most floodgates. Anti-Spell Fragrance meant no fusion spells, and Vanity's Emptiness meant no special summoning. Cards like Macrocosmos and Dimensional Fissure made it a long day being a Predaplant player. So it was up to Konami to make cards that could help Predaplants get through floodgates and back row, or find a card that could remove these pesky cards. So you know what they did? They gave them another monster to special summon. In the TCG set Battle of Legend Light's Revenge, the archetype received Odd Eyes Venom Dragon, a level 10 Dragon Fusion Pendulum monster. It required an Odd Eyes monster and a Starving Venom monster as materials. It must be fusion summoned, and then it can be pendulum summoned. Once per turn, you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls, and until the end phase, it gains attack equal to that card's attack. And if it does, this card's name becomes that monster's original name, and replaces the effect with that monster's original effects. If this card in the monster zone is destroyed, you can special summon one monster from your pendulum zone, and if you do, place this card in your pendulum zone. You know it's a terrible card when neither Odd Eyes nor Predaplants ran this card. It addressed neither deck's issues and was more of a card for those who enjoyed the anime or loved playing casuals. Predaplant Banksiogre was introduced in 2018 set Code of the Duelists. It was a level 5 plant that can be special summoned if you treated an opponent's monster with a Predaplant counter on it. If this card was sent to the graveyard, you could place a Predaplant counter on every face-up monster your opponent controls, and if level 2 or higher, they become level 1. Banksiogre was mediocre at best. While it could have been a sound card before the Link era, the game started making players build decks to go first or second. Banksiogre's effect of needing your opponent to have a monster on the field that already had a Predator counter on it for it to summon itself made many consider this card slow. Also, the counter's effect to reduce levels was redundant since Links didn't have levels. If this deck were to keep up with the times, the monsters and Predaplant counters needed a new approach to keep up with the competitive meta. Though the floodgate problem wasn't fully addressed, they did something to make Predator counters useful. In October of 2018, Predaplants gained a staple fusion in the appropriate name set, Soul Fusion. Predaplant Dragostapelia was a level 8 Dark Dragon fusion with 2700 attack and 1800 defense that required one fusion monster plus one dark monster as its materials. Its quick effect allows you to place one Predaplant counter on a face-up monster your opponent controls once per turn. Monsters with Predaplant counters on them have their activated effects negated. This card gave Predaplant counters purpose. With Dragostapelia on the field, your counters now became a pseudo-effect veiler to place on your opponent's monsters. Also, the requirements to make it were simple and easy. It was so simple that everybody who could pick up a quick Super Poly started to add Dragostapelia to their extra decks. You could easily make Dragostapelia or Dragon of the Swamp in certain matchups to get problematic cards off the field with Super Polymerization. Even today, it sees play in mini decks and is usually a staple in fusion decks due to its easy requirements, which is no problem for decks like Branded or Tier Limits. Their new quick play spell card, Predaplants, lets you reveal any amount of Predap cards from your hand to target an equal amount of your opponent's face-up monsters and put Predaplant counters on them and make them level 1 if they had levels. It also had a graveyard effect that allowed you to prevent the destruction of your Predaplant monsters by battle by banishing Predaplast instead. This card was supposed to be a combo piece with Dragostapelia to control the board with Stapelia's continuous effect. It could also be combined with Kamlita Sundew to utilize its effect to fuse with your opponent's monsters. Unfortunately, Predaplants' issues were still in full effect. Monsters with counters didn't stay in the field long enough to have any impact on the game due to various extra deck options, and the deck still suffered from being weak to floodgates and hand traps, and the deck still wasn't quick enough to keep up with the meta due to Master Rule 4. The only cards that saw any play were Scorpio, Darlingtonia Cobra, and Dragostapelia. Only one in-archetype card was printed to help with back row issues. Predaplant Spider Orchid was a plant pendulum with 0 attack and defense. In the pendulum zone, if you activate this card during the main phase, you can target one face-up spell trapper in the field and destroy it. If you think its removal effect was horrendous, as a monster, if you normal or special summoned it during the end phase, you get to discard a plant monster to add one level 4 lower plant monster from your deck to your hand. 2 back-to-back horrendous effects printed on one card. Only being able to hit face-up cards that you know favors if you needed to hit face-down cards, and searching during the end phase of your turn for a piece that you'd want immediately to continue fusion summoning isn't optimal. There's no need to wonder why this card didn't see any play. In 2019, Legendary Duelist Immortal Destiny was brought to the TCG, containing 5 new Predaplant cards to boost the archetype hopefully. The 2 new monsters were Predaplant Heliumpharynchus and Predaplant Trifeoverutum. Heliumpharynchus could be special summoned if your opponent controls a monster with a Predaplant counter on it. If your opponent's card destroys this card in its owner's possession, you can target one Dark Dragon or Dark Plant monster in your graveyard, except this card, and special summon it. Trifeoverutum was a fusion spell that required 3 dark monsters on the field. It gained the original attack to all other monsters with Predaplant counters. Once per turn, if your opponent special summons a monster from the extra deck while you control this card, you can negate the summon and destroy the monster. You can also special summon this card from your graveyard if your opponent controls a monster with a Predaplant counter on it. You just need to see the phrase requires 3 dark monsters to know it became another tech for extra decks. It's tough to say no to a 3000 Dark Dragon fusion, which gives you a free negate once per turn. Now, there were 3 fusion monsters that Predaplants generously gave to the TCG for super poly techs, though Dragostapalia and Venom Fusion Dragon still saw more play than Triffy over Utum due to their materials being simpler. They did receive 3 new spell traps to play as well. Predapractice was their new search card. You could special summon a Predaplant monster from your hand, then you get to search for a Predap card from your deck and add it to your hand. But you were locked, unable to special summon monsters from the extra deck except for fusion monsters for the rest of the turn. Predaprime Fusion was their Archetype fusion card. It was a quick play spell that lets you fusion summon 1 dark monster from your extra deck using monsters on either side of the field, but you have to use 2 monsters on your side of the field. Finally, Predaplanting was their trap card that sent 1 Predaplant monster from their deck to the graveyard to place Predator counters on all face-up monsters your opponent controls, and all their levels were changed to 1 if they were level 2 or higher. If you fusion summon while this card's in the graveyard, you can remove this card from the graveyard to target 1 card in the field and destroy it. The good news was all of them were playable. The bad news is they all had pretty awkward drawbacks for no reason. Predapractice restrictions didn't hinder Predaplants, as fusion summoning was all the deck was built for, and it took the pressure off of Orpheus Scorpio being the primary way of searching through your deck. However, in a format favored by links, you'd have to have the ability to play links in case plans didn't turn out like they usually do, which is the forte if you play Predaplants. Predaprime Fusion forced you to use monsters on the field, but if you wanted to get the most out of this card, you'd have to first get a counter on your opponent's monsters, and have 2 monsters on your side of the field just to be able to use your opponent's monsters. Even though it was obvious this was a way to encourage you to play Triffy over Utum, it cost you nearly 3 resources to get 1 card with a hard once per turn negate. Predaplanting was solid as its graveyard effect popped a card, but only if you fusion summoned, making your best way of popping a card depended on you making fusion monsters. All wasn't lost for our hard to name pronounce archetype. The deck was on the verge of a breakthrough and close to being solid, so they finally made the icing on the cake to boost Predaplants and many other fusion based decks. It didn't go as planned because in March 2020, Dual Overload gave the meta Predaplant Verte Anaconda, a link 2 with 500 attack and needed 2+ effect monsters to make. You can target 1 face-up monster in the field and it becomes dark until the end of the turn. I know that's the effect all of you wanted to hear. Still, it also had this sort of cool effect that allowed you to pay 2000 life points and send 1 fusion or polymerization normal or quick play spell from your deck to the graveyard to make this card's effect become that spell's effect when this card was activated, but then you can't special summon monsters for the rest of the turn. And just like that, Predaplants were the proud owners of one of the strongest link monsters in the history of the game. The ability to have the monster that could become any fusion card was absurd and gave Predaplants a significant boost, and no other decks. There was no way other decks would abuse this card because it was an easy link 2 with simple requirements that anybody, and I mean anybody, could meet, especially a tier 1 meta deck. We'd even go so far to say it's balanced and didn't give decks who had no business fusion summoning easy access to monsters they'd never even touch, including a fusion so strong it could have its standalone deck separate from another archetype that it was created for and create havoc for almost a whole year. There was no way it would let you use specific fusion spells with hard restrictions and bypass them because Verte copies effects and ignores restrictions because they're not activating said spell card. Yes, indeed, even if that ever happened, there'd be no way this card would be allowed to float in the TCG for nearly 2 years, being a menace and having decks play Garnish just to be able to fusion summon monsters of your choice for free. This card was rightfully placed on the ban list in 2022. So, though Predaplants had another great card to use, so did the meta once again. Decks that had more fluidity than Predaplants and could fit better engines, making them versatile. Also, even with all of those disadvantages, none of them were as blatant as the deck still not having a way to deal with spell traps, multiple hand traps, and floodgates shutting them down completely. Our final cluster of unpronounceable support came in Dimension Force in 2022. 5 monsters rounded out our leafy green friends, with 2 of them being pendulum monsters. Predaplant Bufolicula was a level 1 pendulum monster. Its pendulum effect lets you fusion summon 1 dark fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from your hand or field as fusion materials once per turn. With its monster effect, you can add a face-up dark pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand if this card is sent to the graveyard, or add it to your extra deck face-up because it was used as a fusion material. Predaplant Triantis lets you use monsters in your pendulum zone as monsters for a fusion summon if it's for a dark type monster. With its monster effect, it enables you to choose monsters in the field up to the number of monsters you control and put predator counters on them and change them level 1 or 2 or higher if this card is sent to the graveyard or add to the extra deck face up as a fusion material. Predaplant Biblis lets you add 1 Predaplant monster from your deck to your hand if it's sent to the graveyard. And if there's a card with a predator counter in the field, you can special summon this card from your graveyard, but banish it when it leaves the field. Their newest fusion monster, Predaplant Ambuladius, was a level 5 dark plant requiring 2 Predaplant monsters that search a Predaplant monster or Predap spell or trap card from your deck, graveyard, or face-up extra deck on its summon. Once per turn, you can target a monster your opponent controls with the Predator counter and 1 monster you control, tribute it, and if you do, special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck. Finally, their new boss monster, Starving Venom Preda Power Fusion Dragon, was a level 10 dragon fusion that required 1 dark fusion monster plus 1 fusion monster's materials. It's always treated as a Predaplant card. Once per turn, when a card or effect is activated, you contribute 1 monster in either field with a Predator counter, and if you do, negate the activation. If this fusion summon card you control is sent to the graveyard by an opponent's card, you can target 1 dark monster in your graveyard and special summon it. It's safe to say this was the best wave of support for Predaplants. The pendulums let Predaplants to gain board presence through either the pendulum mechanic, or through Bufolicula and Triantis' effects that let you fusion summon with pendulum scales, saving you extra resources. Biblis was a searcher and extension alongside Ambulomedius, an additional searcher who also doubled as an instant fusion target. And Preda Power Fusion Dragon gave the deck an Omni Negate, being able to tribute opponent's monsters or Predator counters to negate your opponent's cards, and costing them more resources. Its effect in reviving a dark monster from the graveyard is flexible, letting you bring back any dark monsters, including your previously summoned Predaplant fusions, including this card, multiple searchers and more consistency to their engine for fusion summoning. Also, fusion decks became more viable thanks to the Master Rule 4 revisions not restricting making extra monsters to the extra monster zone any longer. However, the deck still wasn't strong enough to stand independently. Most of these core engine cards were used and branded due to synergy between the 2 archetypes, plus the fact that Bufolicula could special summon any dark fusion monster and save branded resources. What goes from just ending with Mirror Jade and Aluber could end up with Mirror Jade, Red Eyes, Dark Dragoon, Albion, Dragostapelia, and a set of Predaplanting and branded beast. The deck was near perfect. Well, almost, as it could sometimes give enough bricks to build affordable homes and still took L's to cards like D-Barrier and Anti-Spell Fragrance, which people who were prepared to see branded cited throughout the meta. So the problem that Predaplants had was never solved, even when combined with a more potent archetype. So far, this is what the Predaplant archetype has to work with. Unlike most failed cards and mechanics, our carnivorous green friends are playable in regular TCG and Master Duel. It feels like they could have been more if they didn't have to depend on a flimsy mechanic, dealing with counters, and having absolutely no way to interact with back row or spell and trap cards. They then had to go through Master Rule 4, being a deck that needed multiple extra deck zones to do something, and by the time the Master Rule 4 revisions came out, the deck was just flat out irrelevant due to better fusion decks available for players at the time. Finally, the Predaplant counters were nearly useless. Even when you would place them, it was easy for your opponent to get rid of them by simply using said monster into an extra deck summon. Also, with how Predaplant counters work, while they might hinder synchros and XCs with level manipulation, they really do nothing against links or fusions outside of monsters like Clematis Sundew, Dragostapelia, and Triffy over Utom. It's tragic when you realize how much Predaplant cards impacted the meta, yet strong engine searchers, powerful extra deck monsters, and its archetype and attribute being one of the best in the game didn't take Predaplants anywhere. Hopefully Konami isn't done supporting the archetype as a whole, and one day, not have Predaplant players praying to draw into a lightning storm to handle their back row. As of now, just put these plants in some potted soil and let them sit on the windowsill. Today, veganism does not prevail.